Hi, everyone. Welcome to Talking Biopolitics. I'm Marcy Darnofsky. I'm the Executive Director at the Center for Genetics and Society, and you're here for the second in our series of 2013 Talking Biopolitics web interviews with people who have been thinking at the cutting edge of the new biopolitics and writing books and have a lot to say. Today we're going to be talking, as you know, with George Estreich, who has written a memoir called The Shape of the Eye, and Emily Batics, the Assistant Director at the Longmore Institute on Disability at San Francisco State University. And we're going to be taking your questions, bringing them into the mix as well. You can type your questions, actually, at any point during this webinar in the Q&A box that you'll see on the screen. It's at the bottom right at the moment. Before we get started, Emily Batics is the Assistant Director at the Paul K. Longmore Institute. And it's a special pleasure for me to welcome Emily here today because Emily is a former staff person at the Center for Genetics and Society, and we're so happy to have her back in the office and to be working with her actually on a number of projects that we'll be saying a word about later. And here's George. So George, you all set now? And are you unmuted as well? Great. Okay, let me introduce you. George is an award-winning writer and poet, and he also has the good fortune of being an at-home dad. He lives in Western Oregon with his family, and he has, to our great good fortune, been a regular guest contributor over the past month to our blog, Biopolitical Times. He's written a series on the marketing of new fetal gene tests that I think is just a wonderful look at the issues that those tests raise, and that I expect we'll be hearing more about his thoughts on that. And he's also written a post on The Amazing Spider-Man and another on the Twilight books. But what we're going to focus on today is his memoir, The Shape of the Eye, which won the 2012 Oregon Book Award in Creative Nonfiction. And what's just been released is the paperback edition of that book, which has a new afterword by George. And the paperback edition has been getting a lot of attention. It's been reviewed and praised in places that maybe people on this call don't run into that often, People Magazine included, but also in numerous parenting and disability rights publications and blogs. George, thank you so very much for being with us today. So can we hear you now? Good, okay. Okay, so I think we're all set. The webcams are set. The phone is set and start. George, this is, I guess, a fallback that you're going to be talking by phone to Emily, but it'll work. So I'm going to now turn it over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Marcy, and thanks for letting me do this. I'm really excited to get to be working with CGS on this, and excited to get to talk with George because his book is really, really smart, really beautifully written, and does a lot for the world of disability activism and disability rights. So just sort of a general comment before we start talking, I think that one of the things that is most important about your book is that disability advocates have for a very long time now been raising concerns about prenatal testing. And the reason is that they say that when parents have to think about whether or not to test and then, what life will be like if they do have a child with a disability, there's such an impoverished imaginary of what they think about. They think only about tragedy, about difficulties. And that's because that's the, majority of messages that we have out there. And I think your book is so important for filling that void and offering another story. And, you're one of a conversation now that shows something different because you're very honest about, hardships, but there's so much joy, there's so much happiness and laughter in your book. And it's just very important what that adds. And we want to get it out there. So in your memoir, you describe clearly feeling this pull toward wanting to understand, what does the extra chromosome mean for Laura, but really much bigger, what do chromosomes mean for us all, and in particular in relationship to one's family and family tree. Can you talk a bit about what made you set out on this journey especially when so much of what you found was so negative, what made you decide to look at Down syndrome through a genetic lens? And, what did you gain and lose in doing so?
One of the things that I found as I was writing this book was that I could not just tell Laura's story, because you can't just tell the story of a kid with Down syndrome without taking cognizance of how that story is told. And obviously in our time, Down syndrome is at the beginning of clinical genetics. It's always been the leader, the first thing tested for. It's a big chromosome, it's easy to see. And so as I was telling the story of an individual child, I was also trying to say, this is the general story told about a ghost. And so it was really important for me to do that. There were costs to that. I remember one evening in the basement of the library with just a splitting headache after having read through maybe 15 or 20 unbelievably scientific seeming but partial descriptions of Down syndrome, just emphasizing the negative in every single way. Recent things for the most part. Textbooks from the 80s referencing similarity to primates, things like this. And to know that's out there, the part of me that wants to face the worst of it and just know, well, I want to know the worst, that I gravitate towards that. But as a dad, it doesn't make for the best day necessarily. But I'm glad I did it. I had to do it.
Similarly, how do you close yourself off to thinking quantitatively? When so much of what you found was these risk factors and going into numbers, how do you as a dad turn that off after you've, read it for research for the book?
In the earlier days, it was harder. In the very early days, when I was researching Down syndrome as a dad, I knew nothing about Laura, and she was sleeping, and I think the way I put it was she was a screen on which our fears could be projected. So she was the numbers. If you have a newborn infant with Down syndrome and you read, say, that there's a whatever % chance of mortality in heart surgery, that becomes, it's not abstract at all. As I turned to the project of writing the book, as I knew Laura better and better, the statistics seemed almost absurd. I mean, I understood that they were probabilistic descriptions. I thought of them as the description of a ghost. And so for that reason, I was able to separate them from Laura. And part of that is Laura has a very great force of personality. She has a big personality. So the statistics seem kind of pale next to her.
Yeah. I mean, and that's something that, I feel like you come across in just about every memoir that's come out of the disability community, is people saying that the statistics got them wrong. I mean, in Harriet McBride Johnson's book, she has this beautiful book that's called Too Late to Die Young, because the statistics say she's going to pass away when she's born, and she goes to college, and she says, it's too late now, got to keep going, I'll go to law school, I mean, that's so common once those numbers are upon you. There's so many stories out there of people being, missing the mark, and so you have to turn it off and look the other way.
Well, that's right, and I think for me, this was one way of healing the break between the past and present for me, which is to say, thinking about the paucity of numbers gave me a reason to think about the importance of story. In other words, I had been a writer, I chose to be a writer long, long ago, long before I had a kid with Down syndrome. But so Laura's presence renewed the relevance of that fact, that that story can charge event with meaning. It can take in the numbers and put them in context, and it can restore the texture of life as it's actually lived that the numbers don't necessarily convey. And I think it's also a correction to the things that people imagine when they hear a number. Like if you hear a number about, say, mental age, for example, I wanted to give something very specific and concrete to counter that.
Mm-hmm. So at the Longmore Institute, one of our priorities is to try and change people's perceptions of disability, and specifically we talk about trying to get people to see disability as a generative force. And so, in other words, rather than these mainstream ideas about people with disabilities, it's solely deficit or tragedy, rather there's innovation and creative thinking, and all of that comes specifically out of, the experience of having a disability. One of the easiest tangible examples that always comes up is the curb cut. That was a change that we made to built environments because wheelchair riders were demanding it. And then look who uses it now, people with strollers with their babies, or luggage, or bike riders and skateboarders. So I know myself, I come to the world of disability, and the reason why I do the work that I do is in part because I grew up in a household with a mother with a disability. You come to this as a father with a child with a disability. What ways for you is being a father with a disability, is that a generative force? Like, what experiences have you had that you wouldn't have ever gotten to have if you just had, a child without Down syndrome?
Well, I mean, that's a great question. This is one of them. Getting to come here and talk about these kinds of issues that are very, very important to me. Anterior to that, coming to understand democracy in a different way, if that's not too grand. I mean, you talk about the curb cuts. That's a perfect example of saying, even though it may have begun with with a special interest seeing a need, it turns out to be good for everyone. What I particularly like about that idea is it's not a compensatory model where you say, where one says kids with Down syndrome have trouble with abstractions, but they're really sweet, a kind of zero-sum balancing. It's more something more radical than that, which just says we should be as inclusive and broad as possible in thinking about who counts. And these were things I did not think much about before. I only thought about them because of Laura, and that's been huge for me. It's changed the way I thought. And I've met many, many people whom I never would have met had I not had Laura and gone on the journey, though I kind of hate that word, of writing this book.
Yeah, so community, yeah, that's really really interesting. And that point that you raised about the sweetness, can you talk more about that? I know that's kind of like the tulips analogy, right? So that there's...
Oh, yeah, the whole roses going to Holland thing. Yeah. So what Emily's referencing is a very famous parable by Emily Pearl Kingsley called Welcome to Holland. And the whole parable is that having a child with Down syndrome is like booking a trip to Italy and landing in Holland instead. And at first you're disappointed, and then you learn what's great about Holland, including the tulips and the Rembrandts and so on. Emily Pearl Kingsley has done a huge amount. She wrote for Sesame Street. She got kids with disabilities on Sesame Street, and she was a crusader as a parent and remains a really inspiring figure. That said, the Welcome to Holland metaphor never did a lot for me. My wife said, early on when things were bad, she said, this is more like Welcome to Croatia. The sweetness thing is tough because a lot of people have a very positive impression of people with Down syndrome. And I much prefer that to those who feel that they're simply a burden on our society or whatever. That said, the problem with describing people with Down syndrome as sweet is that it is a group description, a collective description. And my impulse is always to say, can we nudge the common sense more in the general direction of citizen and individual? So Laura's sweet. I mean, she's sweet in her own way, except on the days when she's not. But she's mostly sweet. But it's Laura being sweet, not Down syndrome being sweet.
Mm-hmm. I want to get into the questions that your book is especially sort of smart about, and a new approach where you talk about prenatal testing and what that meant for you. And can you start by just talking sort of generally about the tension between reproductive rights and the disability critique of prenatal testing, both as it's played out to date and also how you see it changing as the testing is changing, as you've followed and written about?
I can, but do you have any easier questions? I can try. I think that tension is unquestionably there. I think that these issues are so charged, and abortion, of course, is the hot button of all hot button issues. For me, I take a little bit of a strange perspective on this, or not strange, but just come at it from the side, which is to say a couple of things. One, Laura's 12. We haven't thought about these issues for a long time. You know, as I write in the book, Teresa's personal feeling, her personal choice was that she did not want to go through an abortion and therefore did not want to have a test which, amnio at the time, which carried its own set of risks. She doesn't see the point, and I don't either, of doing testing that you already know how you're going to act. In terms of that very difficult territory between disability rights and reproductive rights, I think if there's any Venn diagram, if there's any overlap, it's in the portrait of people with disabilities, which is to say, how do or we do not welcome people with disabilities into our society, and to what extent is the technology simply neutral, offering another option, or to what extent does the technology itself tilt us in a different direction? The other thing that's worth noting in this debate and is that for people with disabilities, specifically people with Down syndrome, the thing I noticed as I was researching this book is that they are often rarely talked about as individuals. They tend to be talked about as they. And I kind of had this image of them being left in the side of the road as we kind of thundered onto some huge topic like eugenics or abortion or education and so on. And I think to the extent that I have a contribution, it's to try and restore a sense of particularity and variation. Less to weigh in on the hot button issues themselves than to say, if a portrait of Down syndrome is introduced for one side or the other, if Down syndrome is weaponized to make a point in the world of reproductive rights from either side, I'm really going to resist that, because I'm going to insist on that idea of citizenship, on variation, and on value for the people who are living. I do oppose the times when people who are living are misrepresented to make a point about the possible, because I think often that's when the portrait is tilted very severely towards the negative.
Mm-hmm. So having been a parent in those early phases where you were learning and adjusting to having a child with Down syndrome, and at the same time what you say is mourning the vision of the normal child that sort of is put in your head. How do you respond to the perspective that comes up a lot, where people advocate for testing, that everyone should test regardless of what you're going to do, because if you are going to have a child with a disability, it gives you more time to adjust and learn. Having been through that experience yourself, what do you think about that?
So I don't know. I mean, we haven't been through the experience of testing. I've certainly read the accounts of people and heard from people who said that, in fact, that test did give them time to prepare. It gave them time to adjust, and that kind of shock and grief and everything that I described happens before the child arrives. That it can do that is no question, but I think that even talking about this on the individual level is a partial view. I don't think that's the main market for the test. And I think that, if we're going to be realistic, we're going to say that the vast majority of people who go to this test are not going to be taking the test in order to prepare for a child with a disability. I could be completely wrong about that, but I don't think so. I think the demand for the test is rooted in people who want to avoid that disability. I make no assumptions about the reasons for that. That is an incredibly difficult decision. It's a morally serious decision, and Alison Pietmeyer is a scholar, women's studies scholar, College of Charleston, who's doing some really, really important work on this. But as a statement, as you say, that is used to support the technology, I think we have to press on that a little bit harder and ask who's going to use it and why.
So related to that, you've written some posts for Biopolitical Times about the way that these tests are marketed. Can you elaborate and speak a bit more about what you've seen, in some of the specific tests?
Yeah. So it's a very fine line for marketing, because obviously anything that's just very blatant and negative is going to trigger backlash. What I found was that if for the companies selling these products, the condition itself was shaded subtly but definitely with the negative. That happens in a number of ways. One, in it being linked to other conditions that can be tested for that are similar under the microscope, like trisomy 13 and trisomy 18, but are much severer. For example, Down syndrome typically has a life expectancy now of around 60. Those have life expectancies measured in months or weeks. So to print a chart where you say, well, we're looking for those three things is obviously going to make Down syndrome seem much worse, much more like something to avoid. The language tends to be shaded. It tends to be not neutral. It tends to be more a matter of, say, risks than chances. Medical problems tend to be highlighted, and so on. Success stories are given of people who avoided the condition. And so, these things happen not because people are evil somewhere on any end of the test or the marketing. I don't think that. But I do think that they're a result of the pressure to sell a product.
Mm-hmm. The choice of testing comes up early in your book, and you mentioned, why you made that decision. I'm surprised to see that in some of the media coverage of your book, that's been something that is put out there very early on, that he had the choice, they didn't do it. And similarly, you mentioned that, even after you had Laura, that was one of the first questions people would ask you, is, assuming that, if you had tested, this couldn't have happened. It situates Laura as an anomaly. Having felt that so personally and still seeing that happen in the coverage of your book by people who presumably read your book, what are your thoughts on, what's driving that question? Why does that have to keep coming up? And, that's a challenging question, but I guess I mean, because you think about culture too, situating this in bigger trends.
Right. Well, one reason it comes up is because of the ubiquity of the technology. And this is another way in which the technology is not simply a neutral thing. It does offer a choice. And it has to be said that, when we're talking about things like the new non-invasive prenatal tests, a test that does not entail a risk of miscarriage is obviously, from a woman's perspective, has its advantages, right? On the issue of why that question keeps coming up, I think I would link back to what I was saying before about our habit of rushing past the individuals to the big issues. I think that when some people see a child with Down syndrome, they're not thinking about that child. They're thinking about what that child reminds them of. And more that means prenatal testing. One of the disturbing things that it has come up is that there's a suggestion that the very fact of a choice being available can lead to disapproval of the parents who don't take that choice. So, for example, and I've seen this to a small extent. I saw there was one comment came out on a review about, I think the quote was, "We have the technology to detect and the technology to abort. They deserve their misery." So it's a little odd putting your story out there and knowing that that's there. But I think it does speak to the ubiquity of the technology and to the importance of the kind of thing we're doing in raising the larger questions of human value in which the technology is embedded.
In a somewhat related question, one of the things that I think was really strong in your book is, and a conclusion you come to near the end, so I hope it's not a spoiler, but that because of genome testing becoming so widespread and growing, not just prenatal, but also, know your genomes and know everything that you're at risk for, whether it's breast cancer, heart disease, diabetes. You say that maybe Laura sort of foreshadows something new, where we all know our risks, but Laura's is visible. So I'll steal a question that's on the Disability Humanities listserv right now. People are saying, how can we change the language so that risk alone is kind of removed, because that's so coded, that's so negative from the start. Do you think, as an English professor, do you think that gets us somewhere, or is this just so much bigger than language and discourse?
I'm going to just be really nice and say yes to both. I mean, yes, the language matters, and yes, the language is not. I think that in the charged diagnostic situation where a diagnosis is being disclosed, whether prenatal or postnatal, every word matters. Because, the difference between the word risk and chance, the difference between Down syndrome being diagnosed or identified, these are very big deals, because what we're implying is something about the line between health and diversity. What kind of condition is a human variation, part of the human family, and what is something that is unhealthy? So I think that the language matters a lot, but I think it's a mistake to say that if we just change the language, then that will be enough. One point worth mentioning, and other people have made this before me, is that our common insults, moron, imbecile, retard, so on and so on, it all started out as diagnoses. The original name for Down syndrome was Mongolian idiocy. So to me, there's this kind of wordless force beneath the words that drags ordinary words into service as insults. That's what really interests me. I mean, one can be, the other thing is that, people can be perfectly polite, but, just speaking as a dad of a kid in special ed, people can use all the right language, but to me, it's where is the child actually placed, So I think I've written this before, that there's a big difference in Down syndrome community between saying Down syndrome child and child with Down syndrome. But I would rather someone say the Down syndrome child is in the mainstream class to Down syndrome is in the special class. Mm-hmm. So the language matters, but placement and funding matter a lot.
Mm-hmm. Challenging the widespread use of the R word is, there's so far to go. One of the moments that haunts me is being a first-year grad student and being in an elevator with somebody who is just known for being a kind of aggressive personality, and she was going off on somebody in the class, and she said that girl, I can't stand that girl. She's sexist. She's homophobic. She's so retarded. And that, like, somebody who can be, I think even in academia, even in, circles where we're thinking about these things, it's shocking how regularly people don't think of the language around mental and cognitive disabilities in that way. There's a long way to go.
But that's a great story. It's a depressing story, but it's a great story because it so clearly illuminates the way in which disability often just doesn't make the cut for people as something that they really care about. Mm-hmm. So that I've seen parents and who use the R word, not many, but I know that there are some sane parents who, if their kids were to ever use the N word, it would be like, grounding and free from devices for a week and the whole thing, but that there's not that next connection made that for the same reasons, because you're misnaming a group, because you're using a group as a generic insult. The R word, as we call it now, is just as bad. Mm-hmm. Arguably worse, because the people misnamed by it have a harder time responding. And that's, that's troubling, but at the same time, I see a lot of hope. I expected so much teasing and bullying when Laura was born, and we really have not seen that. And we've seen a lot of people rooting for her in a meaningful and she's in a regular class. So,
Participant lines unmuted.
so yes, there are many ways in which that there are troubling things that we see all the time, but there's some pretty hopeful things too.
Yeah, and I think it's not to have that conversation is not to get into the sort of competing oppressions, but it does show that the language conversation around disability has not been as public, and there's further to go. Well, I have more questions for you, but there's questions that are starting to come in from the participants in the webinar, so I want to ask some of those. What will your next writing projects be?
So let's see. I have several. And I'm not sure which way other will pan out. I'm thinking about children's book. Part of teaching Laura to read is I came on the odd idea of instead of beginning with what I wanted to say and letting the audience take care of itself, so maybe beginning with audience and write a book that way. So I actually tried this out at an elementary school where I wrote it. I just started telling them a story about a spark we're playing, the vampire pony, and I thought that this would be just fun for them. They enjoyed it, so I think I better find a nice way to do that. So that's one project. Most of what I've been doing has been writing for CGS, which has been really rewarding. It not only gives me a deadline, which gets me to write things, but I get great feedback, and I get feedback, immediately from people on the web, which is great. What I'm hoping is that those different takes, especially on genetics and pop culture, will pull us either into a collection of pieces or into a more kind of closely argued book. So those are the two things. And I need to write my form. I just wrote the first one I've written in years, so I'm going to go to writing. Good.
Another question from the audience. What's the relevance of your experience for the future of fetal gene tests, when we can learn about hundreds of traits or risk factors?
So this was something I talked about a little bit in the book, that I see Laura as on the cutting edge a little bit, which is to say a syndrome is a collection of probabilities. So when a child if you know that child has an extra chromosome, then you know a whole set of probabilities for things that are not health-related and that are health-related. The thing is, we all have that set of probabilities, we just don't know it. And so I don't know the way things are going to go. I don't know whether we're going to essentially expand or tighten the circle of things that get counted as health. I would like to see Down syndrome understood as human variation. That's the way I understand it. It's Laura's way of being human. I know, the difficulties. I know the limits, having lived through them as a parent. But at the same time, I would like to see us expand the circle a little bit. Whether the technology leads us to saying, well, gosh, we all have sets of risks. We can't just trace the line between normal and abnormal anymore, or whether we just, really double down and try to tighten the circle of normal or even improve. I don't know. I simply don't know.
Going back to the tension between, between disability rights and abortion rights, do you think things are getting better?
I would have to ask what defines better. I would like to think so. I see, at least in the discussions that I've been involved in, I've seen people on a very broad political spectrum turning away from the kind of inflammatory bit and willing to have a conversation about meaningful things. I mean, that Kennedy and Brownback were able to get together on legislation seems to me one kind of example of that. So I'm hopeful. I'm not sure I'm even qualified to survey the whole field and say, well, we're getting better, we're getting worse. It's multifarious and kind of scary, but I'm maybe blinkered but hopeful.
So someone, Diane Tober, asked, to what degree do you have to confront stigma or blame from people who are uninformed, and how do you deal with it? I imagine that like most people in the disability world, it becomes something you get a lot better at and sort of learn strategies. But can you share, what that's been like for you?
It's really interesting. It's gotten easier for me. I mean, it's gotten easier for me partly because our situation has changed. We've been in our town so long now that Laura is pretty much known where she goes, and she's pretty well accepted. I've also, comfortable enough with where I am that if people have a big problem with Laura, it kind of is their problem. Laura's a good kid. She's trying to learn like everyone else her age and go to school and, belong and thrive and all the things that parents want their kids to do. So I'm fortunate, I'm glad to report that I don't have a lot of in-person experiences to report. I have pretty much stopped reading the comment sections in after articles about prenatal diagnosis because some of the hostility there is so extraordinary and so overt that A, there's no response that would be useful to it, and B, it's just going to mess up my day. So there is a decision about what kind of conversation you can have and what not. If someone casually uses the word retard around me, I'll just say, hey, you know what, I have a daughter with Down syndrome, do not do that. But that has to be done in a way that leaves the door open to be like, we messed up, I understand it wasn't meant, and so on and so forth.
In a related question that I had, I don't know if you identify as a disability studies scholar yourself, but I think there's so many examples in your book of what disability studies scholars call the medical model, where disability is seen as entirely an impairment to be cured or erased and prevented altogether. Disability is a deficit. And so the first part of your book really begins in the heart of the medical model, it seems, and then the social model of disability, what that last question got at, where disability is created because of discriminatory attitudes and the built environment. Do you feel that do these models fit with your experiences? And what is disability for you?
That's an even harder question, but I will. I will try and answer it. Disability is, in Laura's case, a physical fact. The chromosome is real and observable. The heart-shaped defect is real. Her difficulties with speech, her difficulties with abstraction, these are all real. They're not only constructed. But the biology is not fake. I think that what you're talking about in the early part of the book, where I talk about that sense of being overwhelmed and even fading, it was ascribing too much importance to the biology and not enough to nurture to the sense that we make of that biological fact. So I guess what I wanted to do in the book was to try and honor some of the best of science and medicine, to which we do in fact owe Laura's life, especially particularly in heart surgery. But at the same time, to say that does not offer a complete view, and that ultimately, when we were talking about a kid, we were talking about a citizen. And so the proper model, we're talking about a citizen, is rights and belonging, not like what condition do they have. Mm-hmm. I'm trying to move away from the idea that the condition is determinative or even the most important thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So is there any advice that you would give to parents who are considering whether to use fetal genetic testing?
I don't have advice because that is so intensely personal that I couldn't even presume. Every family is different. Whether someone is ready for any child or a child with Down syndrome has to do with economics, it has to do with values, it has to do with community support, it has to do with family history, it has to do with so many things. And so, for me to say, well, yeah, I think you should, use this test, or no, I think you should not, I would feel really irresponsible. This point goes to a larger thing about the book, which is to say, I didn't write it to say, well, look, you may have had a negative impression of Down syndrome, it's better than you thought. I wrote it to say, you may have had a general impressions of Down syndrome, and here's a particular idea. And so in line with that, the more I've written about Laura, the less I understand about Down syndrome, the more I just know about Laura. So given that perspective, I'm very, very hesitant to advise anything beyond, find a doctor whom you trust and, seek the best sources you can and be extra super careful on the internet.
But I think that, I guess why I would recommend your book and not be humble in the way you're being, what I think it benefits is it's not just that parents would say, okay, so that's what Down syndrome looks like because of this one example, I know I'll have that. It's the way that your wife, Teresa, and you learn to adjust. It's so helpful. So the first time I read your book, I was not even pregnant yet, and the second time I read your book, I now have a 6-month-old son. And so much of it was very relatable to just think about how before you have any kid, you don't know what it's going to be like. You have no idea how you're going to be as a parent, or like you talk about with the second child feels so daunting, you have no idea. So I think just seeing the way that you grow into being advocates and that you grow into this new understanding of family and of parenthood and of what childhood is, it is really helpful for parents thinking about what that might be. That's what, personally, one of the things that I gained.
That's wonderful. And I've gotten so many reactions to this book, but one of the best things and one thing that really means so much to me is that when parents of kids who are typically developing say, this really resonates with my own experience, that there's a core similarity there. And that was something I didn't believe when Laura first came along. I thought things were going to be radically different and that everything I learned with my older daughter would not apply. And it turned out I was wrong. I was just flat wrong.
So we have a question from Doug Pett, who's asked, who are the opinion leaders that can make the most meaningful differences for the future lives and experiences of people with Down syndrome or other disabilities? And if you could choose one community to read and understand your book's message, which would it be? Would it be advocates, people living with disabilities, parents, physicians?
That's a great question. I'm going to start in reverse order. If I could choose one community to read and understand my book's message, it would be physicians. And that was actually that was the thing I did earlier today. I was at San Francisco General Hospital talking to a new resident, and it was a great conversation. And what I was trying to get across was this idea that the things that are, the treatment that happens in the hospital, the emergent things, all that stuff, the surgeries, for the doctor, that's a very close focus thing. They're just thinking about getting you fixed the next hour, the next day. But the parent is thinking about the whole life. The parent is thinking about, we do this because we love our child and because we want that child to thrive as much as possible. So I guess what I want to give a picture of ordinariness of why we undertake medical procedures in the first place, that valuing that life that's arrived. Who are the opinion leaders to make the most meaningful differences? That's a really good question. Celebrities, to be honest. I mean, we can talk about Glee a little bit. I think that's made some difference. If Jane Lynch says that, you shouldn't use the R word, I think that's as good an authority as you can have. Politicians, particularly those politicians who are willing to separate questions of value from the most vicious partisan politics. I understand partisan is going to be there, but there is a certain way in which disability can be weaponized for a particular use, say in reproductive rights or in talking about health care, and that's something that I really resist.
Yeah. Well, boy, we could spend a really long time talking about Glee and disability, but we're getting close to the hour, so we want to pass it back to Marcy Darnofsky to wrap things up and tell us a bit more about webinars that are coming. But George, I've really enjoyed talking with you.
Thank all of you for bearing with us in through the technical difficulties that we've had. We'll be sending you information in an email about the resources that you see on the screen there, about how to get the book, about the Longmore Institute on Disability, about CGS. On our website, we have some compilations of news commentary and news articles about disability rights and genetic technologies, and also about assisted reproduction. So you'll be getting all that. And there are also a number of ways that you can stay involved with new biopolitics with CGS that you see on the screen now. You can join CGS, Google, Twitter, sign up for our newsletter, all these things. If you do, you'll, I hope, see more of George's wonderful writing in our blog. And there are 2 more Talking Biopolitics events coming up, and we'll be sending you all this again in an email. So again, thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to see you in the next Talking Biopolitics webinar. Thanks, and bye.